Imagine walking into a battlefield where everything looks real. Tanks lined up, troop trucks idling, soldiers assembling, but none of it is. Every vehicle is a decoy, every radio chatter a performance, every roar of motor engines a recorded illusion. That was the battlefield for the Ghost Army. Officially designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, this was no ordinary fighting unit. Their weapon wasn't firepower or artillery. Their weapon was deception. Their battlefield was not only the ground, but the mind and the senses of the enemy. At its core, the Ghost Army consisted of roughly 1,100 men, around 82 officers, and 1,023 enlisted in many accounts. These men weren't just soldiers. They were artists, designers, sound engineers, camouflage specialists, radio operators with a flair for mimicry. Many were recruited from art schools, advertising agencies, design studios. Their mission, to make the enemy see and hear illusions, armies where there were none, tanks where none rolled, radio nets that never existed. The story begins in early 1944. On January 20th, 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was formally activated. The U.S. Army recognized that beyond brute force, war could be shaped by what the enemy believed, by what the enemy perceived. In that sense, this unit would be pioneering. The objective was not to hold ground, but to control the impression of strength, movement, and deployment so convincingly that German forces would make wrong decisions. Training took place under secret conditions. The unit absorbed several specialized groups already in existence. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers, Visual Deception. The 3132 Signal Service Company, Sonic Deception. The Signal Company Special, Radio Deception. And the 406 Engineer Combat Company, Security and Construction Support. By late spring 1944, the unit shipped to Europe, arriving in England in May, just ahead of the D-Day landings. What made this unit unusual was the combination of artistry and military mission. Painters became camouflage officers. Sound engineers built massive speaker trucks. Radio operators used impersonation and mimicry rather than command and control. The concept, if you can simulate a formation of 30,000 men convincingly, the enemy will treat it as real and make decisions accordingly. The Ghost Army's work broke down into three major categories: visual, sonic, and radio deception. Visual deception. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers specialized in building decoys. Inflatable tanks, trucks, jeeps, even airplanes made from rubber canvas shells over light frames. From the air, these looked like real vehicles. Some of these could be inflated in minutes and then positioned with camouflage nets, dust, tracks, even fake troop bivouacs to add realism. These illusions were designed for aerial reconnaissance, to convince German pilots and photo interpreters that armored formations were massing in a location. Sonic deception. The 3,132 Signal Service Company used recorded audio of tanks on the move, infantry marching, pontoon bridge construction, even engine startups. They mounted large speaker trucks and half-tracks and played these sounds at night, sometimes for hours. Some accounts estimate the sound could carry up to 15 miles. The goal, to trick the enemy into believing armored units were moving, deploying, or preparing for attack. Radio deception, impersonation. The Signal Company Special executed fake radio nets, impersonated existing Allied units, mimicked the Morse code FIST of particular operators, used dummy maps and fake unit patches. They could even have impersonators hang around cafes or frontline towns in enemy hearing. Every detail mattered. Together, these three arms created a multi-layered illusion that went beyond simple decoys. This was theater of war, in which every sense was targeted: sight, sound, even rumor. As one officer later noted, "We must remember that we are playing to a very critical and attentive radio, ground, and aerial audience." Although the unit arrived in Europe in May 1944, their first major uses were cautious. The summer of 1944 saw the unit operating in and around the Normandy region. Initially, their decoys and sound trucks were used to divert German attention, to suggest large formations where none existed, and to cover real troop movements. For example, one account notes the Ghost Army simulated the presence of an armored division to mask the withdrawal of another. However, early on they faced problems. The unit's materials and methods were new. Coordination with real combat units was sometimes imperfect. Supply of dummy equipment could be limited. Illusions had to be tailored to the terrain, to weather, and to enemy reconnaissance methods. For example, their inflatable tanks were spectacular in photographs, but less effective when ground troops got close. Training accidents and equipment failures were real concerns. Yet, despite these challenges, the Ghost Army matured quickly. By late 1944, they were regularly called upon to conduct full-scale diversions. They could simulate entire divisions. Some sources say up to 30,000 men, convincing the enemy that major movements were underway. The Ghost Army executed more than 20 deception missions across Europe between 1944 and 1945. Their operations spanned France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, often close to the front lines despite their non-combat role. One of their most famous missions was the deception used during the crossing of the Rhine River, Operation Viersen, in March 1945. The Ghost Army simulated the buildup and crossing of two infantry divisions at a point where no crossing was planned, drawing German defensive attention away from the real crossing site. Another mission involved filling a gap in the line during the fighting around Metz, Lorraine, in September 1944 by simulating a large force presence while actual units repositioned. Their impact is estimated in terms of lives saved. Some sources suggest that their operation saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives by misleading German forces about where attacks would occur. Consider what that means. A handful of decoy tanks, speaker trucks, and fake radio nets may have prevented thousands of men from walking into deadly German defenses because the enemy diverted forces elsewhere. The strategic effect was psychological as well as physical. German intelligence and reconnaissance learned to doubt what they saw. A tank silhouette might fool the eye, but unless it clicked with movement, sound, and radio chatter, the enemy might detect something amiss. Their holistic approach made deception effective. Behind every inflatable tank and massive speaker truck stood real men, many of them unconventional soldiers. Artists like Ellsworth Kelly, painter, and Bill Blass, fashion designer, served in the unit. One soldier recalled that his training required him to master camouflage techniques by day and learn radio impersonation by night. Their backgrounds often included art schools, design agencies, photography studios. These were men whose tools before the war had been brushes, cameras, typography, not machine guns or tanks. They were trained in construction of fake vehicles, but also in how to sit at a cafe in a frontline town and casually mention the arrival of their division in conversation, so that local spies might overhear and pass the info to German intelligence. Every detail was a part of the illusion. Some of them even drove false command cars, wore patches of other units, or planted fake maps and logs. The art school background of many men meant creativity wasn't a liability. It was their advantage. They knew perspective, shadow, texture, all useful when you inflate a fake tank and want aerial reconnaissance to buy it. They understood sound, timing, and movement. They brought theater into war. Despite the novelty and camouflage of their role, the danger was real. The Ghost Army often operated near or even behind active front lines. Because they were meant to simulate combat units, their decoys were placed in positions that could draw enemy fire. Some were wounded or killed during their missions. It's tempting to think inflatable tanks are a gimmick. Early on, some commanders treated these efforts with skepticism, but over time, the effects spoke for themselves. The Ghost Army's successes shifted attitudes from ridicule to strategic respect. They weren't just showmen, they were force multipliers. Their ability to simulate entire formations of 30,000 men, to project sound across miles, to generate credible radio nets, meant they were changing how warfare was fought. Not just location of front lines, but enemy perception of location, number, direction. By late 1944 and into 1945, their reputation had spread through Allied command and even within German intelligence. Some captured documents from the German side show confusion about Allied orders of battle, thanks in part to the Ghost Army's efforts. Their techniques foreshadowed modern military deception and psychological operations. Controlling enemy perception, using design and sound and radio rather than purely bullets. The concept of information warfare owes some debt to what these men pioneered. After the war ended in Europe in May 1945, the Ghost Army returned stateside and was eventually deactivated. But their story didn't go public. For decades, their operations remained classified. It wasn't until the 1990s that many of their records were declassified. The fact that their story remained hidden added to the mystique. Many veterans kept silent for years, holding to their wartime oath. In 2013, a documentary titled The Ghost Army was released, bringing the unit's story to a broader audience. In recent years, the U.S. Congress awarded the unit the Congressional Gold Medal in recognition of their unique and highly distinguished service. Today, their legacy lives on in special operations, deception units, PSYOPS, and information warfare communities. While no active U.S. Army unit traces direct lineage, the spirit of the Ghost Army remains in the doctrine of influence and deception. So, what does the Ghost Army teach us? First, warfare is not only about direct confrontation. Sometimes the battle is won before a shot is fired in the mind of the enemy. By convincing the enemy that you were somewhere else, with something else, you forced him to react to your illusion rather than his own plan. Second, creativity and design matter in war. The Ghost Army showed that artists, designers, sound engineers, people you'd rarely associate with frontline combat, could alter the course of war through ingenuity. They used inflatable tanks, recordings, mimicry, and misdirection to change where battles would occur, how troops would move, even whether lives would be lost or saved. Third, the value of combined arms of deception, visual plus sonic plus radio. Each alone might raise suspicion, but together they created convincing illusions. Fourth, legacy for modern warfare. In an era of drones, satellites, and signal intelligence, the Ghost Army reminds us that perception remains a vulnerable front. Camouflage and decoys matter. Sound and radio matter. What the enemy thinks is real often drives his action more than what is real. Lastly, human stories matter. These were young men, many barely out of art school, thrust into a war they didn't plan on fighting in this way. They operated behind a veil of secrecy, risking their lives while the world remained unaware. Their recognition only decades later doesn't diminish their service. It highlights how unconventional their mission was. The Ghost Army may never have fired 1,000 shells. Their tanks never earned battle scars. Their convoys never burned on the hills of Europe. But pivotally, the Ghost Army changed how war was done. They fought not with steel, but with shadows. They won not by destruction, but by diversion. They saved lives not by brute force, but by brilliance. When you hear the story of inflatable tanks, speaker trucks, fake radio nets, and artists wearing combat boots, don't dismiss it as quirky. Recognize it as ingenious. Recognize it as war redefined. Because the Ghost Army proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is an idea, and the most enduring image of war might just be the one the enemy never saw.